They never imagined it, not in their wildest calculations. For years, German intelligence had studied every move of the American war machine. They had estimated production rates, steel output, oil capacity, and manpower reserves. But what they failed to consider was who was doing the work. When captured German officers were eventually shown film reels and photos of American factories, vast, roaring, unstoppable, they didn't believe what they were seeing. In the footage, line after line of workers moved with the rhythm of a well-drilled army. But the shock came not from the machines, nor the endless belts of shells, guns, and engines. It came from the faces. Women, thousands of them, smiling, sweating, focused, and fierce. To German officers raised under a regime that insisted a woman's place was in the home, this was unthinkable. The Third Reich had mocked America as weak and decadent, corrupted by jazz, democracy, and Hollywood. Yet now, as the war dragged into its third brutal year, the same decadent nation was outproducing the entire Axis combined, and much of that power was driven by women in overalls, with oil-stained hands and eyes full of determination. The story of how America's women turned factories into battlefronts is one of the least expected revolutions of World War II. It's a story that not only stunned Germany's officers, but redefined the meaning of war itself. Because while bombs fell in Europe, a quieter war was raging across the United States. A war fought with rivets, wrenches, and raw courage. To understand why this shocked the Germans so deeply, we have to go back to the early 1930s, when the world was teetering on the edge of chaos. The Great Depression had crushed economies worldwide. Unemployment was sky high, and for many American families, survival meant scraping by on whatever they could find. Women worked as secretaries, teachers, or homemakers, not welders or machinists. Factories were considered men's territory. Heavy industry was a world of grit, noise, and danger, no place for a lady. But by 1941, the world changed overnight. When Japanese bombs struck Pearl Harbor, America was thrust into a total war it had desperately tried to avoid. Almost instantly, millions of young men were drafted into uniform and shipped overseas. Overnight, the nation faced an impossible question. Who would build the weapons, planes, and ammunition to arm them? Factories that had once made cars and refrigerators now needed to make tanks, bombers, and bullets. Fast. The military's demand for weapons grew so rapidly that by 1942, even the most optimistic industrial planners admitted they didn't have the manpower to keep up. That's when the government launched a campaign unlike any before it. Posters appeared across cities and small towns, showing women rolling up their sleeves with slogans like, "Do the job you left behind, and we can do it." But this wasn't just propaganda, it was necessity. Within months, millions of women answered the call. Housewives, clerks, waitresses, and teachers left their homes and stepped into a new world of noise and steel. They learned to operate drills, lathes, and presses. They built engines for P-51 Mustangs, shells for howitzers, and rifles for infantrymen they would never meet. And for the first time in history, American industry became a truly national army, a force powered not just by men on the front lines, but by women on the factory floor. By 1943, over 6 million American women were working in defense industries. Another 3 million joined federal offices, transport, and engineering jobs. Many of them had never held a tool in their life. Now they were producing precision weapons at a pace that made generals in Berlin stare in disbelief. To the Nazis, the very idea of women doing men's work was absurd. The German regime's ideology held that a woman's duty was to be a mother and homemaker, to serve the nation by bearing children, not by building bombs. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels called the idea of women in industry a sign of weakness, mocking Allied nations for sending their women to work while men went to war. But that arrogance would cost them dearly. Because by the time German officers began seeing reports of America's industrial miracle, massive factories like Ford's Willow Run turning out a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, they realized something terrifying. Their enemy had harnessed every ounce of its population. While German men fought and German women rationed, American women built. And the results were staggering. For every tank Germany rolled off of production lines, America made 5. For every plane the Luftwaffe built, the United States built nearly 10. Every round of ammunition fired on the front lines had a woman's fingerprints somewhere behind it, on a lathe, a press, or a rivet gun. Captured German officers, when interrogated after the war, admitted their astonishment. Many said they couldn't believe it when they saw pictures of young women assembling bombs or welding fuselages. Some even asked, "Are these staged?" Others shook their heads in disbelief, wondering aloud how a nation could fight a total war and still have such vast reserves of labor, skill, and willpower. What they didn't understand was that this transformation had reshaped American society almost overnight. It wasn't just about replacing men with women. It was about redefining what the country itself stood for. In small towns, entire communities revolved around these factories. Children would watch their mothers leave each morning wearing work pants and headscarves, carrying lunch pails like soldiers marching off to battle. Husbands returning on leave were stunned to see their wives or sisters operating heavy machinery. Newspapers called it the New American Army. And it wasn't easy. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and often deadly. Explosion, chemical burns, and machinery accidents were common, yet morale remained high. Women took pride in knowing that every shell they produced might save a soldier's life, or end the war a little sooner. Many of them had brothers or husbands fighting in Europe or the Pacific. Every rivet they drove was personal. Every bullet felt like a message. We're doing our part. Come home safe. It was this emotional connection, the merging of duty, sacrifice, and skill that made America's industrial output unstoppable. But the shock that rippled through captured German officers when they finally realized who was behind it, that was something no production chart could explain. Because for them, this wasn't just an industrial revelation. It was ideological devastation. The idea that women, ordinary women, could power a war machine greater than any in history defied everything the Nazi worldview stood for. And as they watched the silent film reels of American women welding aircraft frames and assembling artillery shells, many realized something that Hitler himself never could. America's strength wasn't just in its machines. It was in its people, all of them. Across the Atlantic, the war was raging with a fury no one could have imagined. Cities were burning. Convoys were sinking, and the fate of entire nations hung on supply lines that stretched thousands of miles. But while soldiers clashed in North Africa and bombers thundered over Europe, another kind of battle was unfolding in the heart of America. Inside the sprawling industrial complexes of Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Seattle, the air trembled with the roar of machinery. Massive presses slammed down with thunderous rhythm, shaking the floors as molten metal poured into molds. Sparks leapt like fireflies in the dim light, and through the haze of smoke and steam moved an army of women in coveralls, goggles, and gloves, each one as vital to victory as any soldier on the front. At Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan, assembly lines stretched longer than entire city blocks. Here, women worked side by side with men, turning sheets of aluminum into the sleek fuselage of the B-24 Liberator. The scale was so massive that the plant had its own bus routes, fire department, and cafeteria for 30,000 workers. The first day many women arrived, they were terrified. The machines were deafening, the air hot and choking with the smell of oil and metal. But they adapted quickly. Training programs transformed housewives into machinists, welders, and inspectors in just a few weeks. By 1943, Willow Run was producing one bomber every 63 minutes, an industrial miracle the Germans thought impossible. Across the country, at the Kaiser Shipyards in California, another revolution was underway. The shipyards, once nearly silent, now echoed with the clang of steel plates and the pounding of hammers. Here, women built Liberty ships, massive cargo vessels that carried food, tanks, and ammunition across the Atlantic under constant threat from U-boats. They were fast, cheap, and built in record time. One ship was famously constructed in just 4 days and 15 hours. German intelligence refused to believe it. They thought the reports were exaggerated, propaganda designed to boost Allied morale. But it was real, and it terrified them. Inside those shipyards worked women like Gladys the Welder, known for completing her first solo weld at age 19, and Lillian the Rigger, who balanced on steel beams dozens of feet in the air. They were joined by thousands more, farm girls, teachers, widows, and mothers, each united by the same quiet resolve, to do whatever it took to win. And it wasn't just planes and ships. In factories across the Midwest, women operated bullet presses that turned out millions of rounds each day. In others, they loaded artillery shells so powerful that a single mistake could mean instant death. In munitions plants, the chemicals turned their hair yellow and their skin pale, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. They laughed about it, even as they risked their lives daily. The scale of their contribution was staggering. By 1944, women made up nearly 40% of the entire American workforce. Over 275,000 of them worked directly in aircraft manufacturing alone. They built 300,000 planes, 88,000 tanks, 2.5 million machine guns, and billions of rounds of ammunition. What stunned German officers most wasn't just the output, it was the precision. Captured after the war, Luftwaffe engineers examined Allied weapons and were shocked by their consistency. Components from factories thousands of miles apart fit together perfectly. In interviews, one German officer reportedly said, "They have achieved something we could never do, not with so many hands, and certainly not with women." In Germany, women had been largely excluded from factory work until it was too late. Nazi ideology insisted they stay at home, raising children and supporting the war spiritually. Only when the war began turning against them, around 1943, did the regime finally begin recruiting women into labor roles. But by then, Allied bombers were pounding their factories nightly and resources were collapsing. Meanwhile, in America, production surged. Even Hollywood joined the effort. Newsreels showed smiling women tightening bolts on airplanes, rolling tanks out of factories, and waving from production lines. Songs like Rosie the Riveter became anthems of pride, blaring from radios in every city. Rosie wasn't a single person. She was every woman who picked up a tool and said, "I can do it." And the Germans were watching. Intelligence reports began filtering back to Berlin. German officers studying captured Allied magazines or news footage during interrogations couldn't hide their disbelief. "Are they truly women?" one was quoted asking. Another commented that America must be using trained actresses to boost morale. But the truth couldn't be hidden for long. As Allied forces captured German territories late in the war, they brought with them crates of American supplies. Ammunition boxes stamped, "Made in Ohio," engines built in California, rifles assembled in Chicago. When German officers saw those markings and realized how far America's industrial arm reached, many were speechless. To them, it seemed almost supernatural. A nation protected by oceans, with no bombed cities or ruined factories, had turned its entire civilian population into an army of workers. Even German prisoners of war held in the U.S. during the conflict were astonished. Some were assigned to work details near American factories and saw the women firsthand. Reports tell of POWs standing silently at fences, watching women operate cranes and welding torches with skill and confidence. One captured German officer reportedly muttered, "Now I understand why we are losing." But it wasn't just the numbers, it was the spirit. These women didn't just work for money or duty. They worked for something deeper. Every hour on the factory floor was a fight for someone they loved, a husband in the Pacific, a brother in Italy, a son in France. Their motivation was personal, emotional, and unrelenting. In interviews decades later, many recalled the same feeling: pride mixed with fear. Pride that they were contributing to the war. Fear that the next telegram might bring news of a loved one's death. Yet they never stopped. Even after exhausting 12-hour shifts, they volunteered for overtime, sewing uniforms or collecting scrap metal for the war effort. As the Allies began gaining ground, first in North Africa, then Italy, and finally Normandy, many German analysts began to suspect what their leaders refused to admit: that industrial power, not ideology, would decide the war. And the backbone of that power was a workforce unlike any the world had ever seen. In 1944, an internal German report estimated that for every 10 German workers producing military equipment, America had 50, nearly half of them women. The math was devastating. Germany could no longer match the Allied output. Its factories were in ruins, its resources dwindling, and its labor force exhausted. And so, by the time American troops stormed across Europe, those same German officers, who had once mocked the idea of women in industry, were facing tanks, planes, and artillery forged by women's hands. Each shell that roared across the battlefield carried a quiet message, one the Germans could finally understand. You underestimated us. By the final months of World War II, the once feared German war machine was crumbling. Cities lay in ruins. Fuel was scarce, and the once mighty Luftwaffe could barely get planes into the air. The Allies were advancing on every front, and with each step, they discovered the staggering scale of what had fueled their victory. American-made tanks rumbled through the Rhineland. Trucks, planes, and artillery pieces, all stamped with serial numbers from factories thousands of miles away, lined the roads. German officers, now prisoners of war, stared in stunned silence as they realized the sheer immensity of the industrial storm that had engulfed them. When Allied troops began showing captured officers' footage and photographs of U.S. production plants, the reaction was unlike anything the interrogators expected. In one documented interrogation, a Luftwaffe logistics officer was shown film reels of women riveting the wings of B-17 bombers at Boeing's Seattle plant. He leaned forward, eyes wide, watching the movement of the assembly line. Hundreds of women working in perfect synchrony. After several minutes, he whispered, This is impossible." Another German officer, once in charge of labor planning for an armaments depot near Essen, was shown photos of women handling 500-pound bombs in an American munitions factory. He shook his head slowly and said, "No German woman will be allowed to do this. Our leaders forbade it. We were told it was dishonor." Those words revealed everything. Germany had imprisoned itself within ideology. While America opened its factories to anyone willing to work, Germany closed its doors to half its population. Pride had become its weakness. And now, the evidence was undeniable. At one POW camp, American guards projected a film showing women at the Ford Motor Company turning car plants into tank lines. German officers watched in silence. Some laughed nervously, assuming it was propaganda. But as the reels continued, showing massive production halls, cranes lifting engines, rows of women inspecting machine guns, the laughter faded. One officer stood and muttered, "Now I see how you did it." What they were witnessing wasn't just industry. It was transformation, social, cultural, and moral. Back in 1942, few Americans could have imagined what they were capable of, but by 1945, the country had built 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 landing craft, and nearly 90,000 tanks. And behind nearly every one of those machines was a woman who had stepped far beyond what society once expected of her. To the Germans, it shattered every assumption they had about power. The Nazi regime had believed that strength came from domination, from rigid control, from ideology, from obedience. What they were now forced to see was that true strength had come from freedom. Freedom to innovate, to adapt, to work, and to believe in something bigger than fear. Even after the surrender, the shock remained. Many captured officers, when sent to internment camps in Britain and the United States, couldn't stop talking about what they'd seen. Some admitted that if Germany had mobilized its women earlier, perhaps the war might have lasted longer. But others were honest enough to say it wouldn't have mattered, because America's strength was not just in numbers, but in unity. In one debriefing report written by U.S. Army intelligence, a German major stated plainly, "You fought with your women as well as your men. We never understood that. We underestimated it." The irony was profound. The same officers who once scoffed at American decadence were now watching the results of democratic strength in motion, ordinary citizens, men and women alike, combining to create the greatest war machine in history. For many German prisoners, that realization was more painful than defeat itself. As they saw newsreels of American women returning home, celebrated as heroes, they began to grasp how far ideology had blinded their nation. In America, these women were welcomed back with banners and parades. They were called the women who won the war. In Germany, those who worked reluctantly in late-war armament plants often returned to silence and shame. It was a stark contrast. Two worlds separated not just by oceans, but by belief. One built a future. The other destroyed its own. When peace finally came in 1945, the factories that had once thundered with war production went silent. The welders set down their torches, the riveters hung up their gloves, and the women who had powered an army began another battle, the return to normal life. Many wanted to keep working. They had discovered purpose, independence, and pride. But society wasn't ready to let them. As men returned from the front, millions of women were laid off or pushed back into traditional roles. Newspapers that once called them heroines of industry now ran ads urging them to go home and raise families. Still, something had changed, something that would never change back. Those years had proved a truth the world could never unsee. Women were as capable, as skilled, and as vital as any man in building the engines of progress. They had built not only weapons, but a new identity. In the years after the war, historians and economists would analyze production charts and logistics numbers. They would write about the arsenal of democracy, about how America's factories had overwhelmed the Axis with output. But what many overlooked was that the soul of that arsenal was human, and half of it was female. For the German officers who lived to see post-war reconstruction, that memory lingered. Some spoke of it with disbelief, others with quiet respect. One, interviewed years later, said, "When I saw those women working, I realized we never stood a chance. You had turned your entire nation into a weapon." And he was right, because America's secret weapon wasn't a bomb or a tank or a plane. It was belief, the belief that everyone, no matter who they were, could serve, build, and fight in their own way. That belief forged an army of women who never held rifles, yet fought just as fiercely as those who did. Women who learned to measure courage not in medals, but in hours worked, blisters earned, and bolts tightened. Their battlefields were factory floors. Their victories were measured in tons of steel, miles of wiring, and ships that sailed faster than anyone thought possible. And though their names rarely appeared in history books, their fingerprints are on every weapon that helped end the war. So when those German officers sat in interrogation rooms, staring at the faces of women welding bombers and building tanks, they were seeing more than workers. They were seeing the face of an America they never understood, an America that thrived not on fear or control, but on possibility. That realization broke the last illusion of Nazi superiority. And as the lights flickered on at the end of those film reels, one truth hung in the silence, a truth that echoed far beyond that moment. It wasn't the machines that won the war. It was the people who built them.